Okay, this is a recorded interview with James Paul for Organic News Awake Radio. James Paul was an executive director for Global Policy Forum, a think tank that monitors the UN for nearly 20 years. He also a longtime editor for the Oxford Champion to Politics of the World and executive director of the Middle East Research and Information Project, and your recent article called Grasping the Motives for Terror for the Consortium News, which states in 2003, the U.S., in partnership with the United Kingdom, attacked Iraq, seeking regime change from the former ally Saddam Hussein. Washington stayed for 8 years until 2011, creating fiendish Islamic militias as part of a vicious counterinsurgency program created by much admired U.S. General David Petraeus and later turned into doctrine at the Harvard Kennedy School. There was round-the-clock bombing, huge prison camps, torture, ongoing military operations throughout the country, leading to a tremendous loss of life among Iraqis. More than 1 million people perished, and a complete destabilization of the country. So I'm just going to we'll go straight to the article now. Also, the chief from MI5 wrote a secret memorandum to Prime Minister Tony Blair, also stating that their meddling is creating, what then they turn around and call terrorists. Can you talk about that?
Yes, I think it's important to understand that high officials in the UK, the US, and France know perfectly well that the policies that they have in the Middle East, and the wars and regime change and violence that they have used there, gives rise to anger and terrorism that can threaten their own population. And we know this from a variety of sources, but I mentioned in this article that I just wrote that the head of MI5, Manningham Buller,
right,
was her name, had spoken in this secret memorandum to UK Prime Minister Tony Blair, had raised this issue and warned him about the consequences, and she had also later given evidence to a inquiry commission about the same subject, and that particular evidence that she provided has been made public, and in that she again said that this effect, which was, as she put it, a whole generation of young persons of Islamic background had been radicalized by UK and Western policies in the Middle East. So these are the people at the top of the counterterrorism and intelligence services of the United Kingdom. And they're saying this, and Tony Blair himself, actually in recent public statements, made an apology for his Iraq war, and he too indicated that he was aware that this had also stimulated terrorist activity of one kind or another. So they're saying this themselves. So when we say it, we're in very good company, let's say, and there's no point in covering this thing over and pretending that it's only about the horrendous people that have carried these things out. And certainly we reject this kind of methodology. We reject this kind of approach by the Daesh, but we also have to, at the same time, to reject the policies that have given rise to this.
So, right, this the woman from MI5, Manningham Buller, she also warned Blair about terrorism too. Sorry, not terror, torture.
Yeah.
Which also proved to be, like that just created more terror recruitment.
Yes. I would say that these officials in the UK were rather confident that their own side hadn't been using torture, and in all the research that I've done, it's quite clear that they have used torture. But in any event, they were concerned about the U.S. use of torture in some of the things that she said, and it's this kind of outrageous behavior on the part of the Western powers. While they're constantly talking about Western values, democracy, respect for people, and all this stuff, they're carrying out these wars and regime change and setting off conflicts within countries in the Middle East that are causing infinitely more casualties, infinitely more suffering than anything any terrorist act has led to.
And why do you think that is? I mean, are they doing it intentionally? They clearly know that they're doing it, and yet they do it.
Well, each particular case has to be looked at in detail to understand what the motivations were, what the actors were thinking at that particular time. But I think we see a pattern of intervention, and that goes beyond any one particular government. And certainly in the United States, we have to remember that Jimmy Carter was as actively involved in policies of this kind as was Bill Clinton, as was George H.W. and his son George W. Bush, and so forth. So these actions go beyond any one particular administration, and I think it's necessary also to look back at the history of colonialism too, European colonialism in the Middle East region and beyond, to see that the something about motivations of control and rule over other peoples and national grandeur and national, most importantly, money. It's about trade, it's about investments, it's about, in the case of the Middle East in the 20th century, it's about oil in particular. And oil has been, the oil companies are the biggest companies in the world, the richest companies in the world, the companies with the most influence over national governments, and national governments act. They see that their action, that whatever the prime minister is or the president, they see it's necessary to defend their own companies and to advance their interests, and they're ready to use military power. They're ready to use the apparatus of this, secret services, the CIA, the MI6, MI5, and so on. They're ready to overthrow governments, to assassinate people in order to advance the interests of these companies.
Right. So this term terrorism is just a, like a front.
Yes. Well, basically it's necessary to understand that violence is being used by states in ways that are infinitely more damaging than the violence that's used by um, by, let's say, movements of one kind or another. Of course, sometimes there are movements that have what we might consider legitimate goals and that use violence nonetheless. Let's say the movement for freedom in South Africa would be an example of that. And persons who are in the leadership of those movements. We should also remember, of course, that George Washington was using violence against the government of Britain in the war for the independence of the United States. So there are cases where violence is used that way, and history judges that violence to which very often is relatively limited compared to the violence unleashed by states. I mean, the British state and the British Navy and all the ways in which Britain ruled its colonial possessions, including such huge areas as India, was vastly greater than in the case of India, the movement for independence was a non-violent movement, and there was relatively little violence that took place certainly within the last years under Gandhi.
Right.
So it's good to speak not about terrorism specifically, but about the use of violence in different ways and for different purposes, and to understand that the states have much, much more capacity to use violence than any of these groups, any of these terror groups. And all of that is not just at all to say that one should somehow agree with with this very, very nasty actions on the part of the Islamic State in France or anywhere else.
So I'm just going to read a little bit from the very beginning of your article that says the Paris terror attacks, particularly the methodical shooting of unarmed civilians, have shocked the world and generated new tough talk from policymakers, but the West cannot ignore how some of its violent policy prescriptions over the past 35 years have contributed to the crisis, writes James Paul. As we mourn the many killed in Paris by the terror attacks of November the 13th, we may be tempted to react mainly with anger and outrage and to rally around the Western governments in their war against Islamic jihadists. But if we want to live in a world free of terror, we must do more than react blindly to support in support of widened Western military campaigns, airstrikes, drone attacks, secret operations, assassinations, destabilization campaigns, secret prisons, and all the apparatus of official violence. We must ask honestly and fairly, what is the Western responsibility for these horrible acts on our cities and our people? Can there be, in our government's actions over the years, causes that would motivate and set in motion such horror, and what might be an alternative? So then the question that I'm going to ask you is, if it is about oil, then this stuff is just going to continue.
Well, you're absolutely right. Stopping this apparatus of Western violence aimed at the Middle East is an extremely difficult business. And the fact is that we need to stop the oil companies for two reasons. One is the violence that the policies that they have contributed so much to shaping and what it has meant for the peoples of the world and the peoples of the Middle East, but also, of course, the terrible effect on the environment that this constant use of oil and the carbon dioxide emissions that are resulting from it, and the climate change, and really the destruction of the whole environment of the planet.
Right. So let's go just briefly, I guess, through the timeline beginning in 1979. supported, the many wars of Israel supported by Washington and other Western governments, wars that have caused great suffering and aroused enormous anger in the region. The warfare in Afghanistan for decades.
Well, I think people are aware that in the case of Afghanistan, the Western powers were, and particularly the United States, was actually involved in financing, arming, and training Osama bin Laden and the Mujahideen that became Al-Qaeda. And so the United States, therefore, created this monster to a large degree, along with the Saudis. And what is fascinating about this history is how many times, again and again, they have supported Islamic fundamentalist movements, and they still are in close alliance with Saudi Arabia, which is a state that is based on a religious doctrine that is fundamental to this jihadism. So this is not just some kind of indirect influence. It's a very, very direct connection. But of course, I'm also arguing that the various wars, and we're talking here about the war in Afghanistan. The war in Afghanistan has been going on for a very, very long time.
Right.
Were themselves fighting. Russian forces were in Afghanistan for about a decade, and there is, we can even go back further and look at the British intervention in Afghanistan. 3 times the Brits sent in armies to conquer Afghanistan in the 19th century, and they failed. And the Russians failed, and the United States and its allies have failed. But the incredible war has gone on and on. And a lot of those people have now fled the region and headed towards Europe and contributed to the flow of refugees coming into Europe. And they've also, some of the fighters have joined other conflicts. And actually people who fought in the Afghan conflicts are known as Afghanis, Afghanis that are very, very highly trained in the use of arms and so on, and they have shown up in other conflicts, including Syria.
And so, I always wonder about the military, the U.S. military themselves. That, after you're in Afghanistan for a while, you can clearly be able to see that, it's not for protecting the safety of Americans, or it's not about terrorism, and yet they continue to stay. I just wonder, why a larger amount of military don't kind of blow the whistle more. They're over there. They see.
Well, I think individual soldiers. I think probably some individual soldiers do speak about their experience there. I sat down in Huntington, Indiana, one evening several years ago with 2 young men who'd done 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan, and they had some pretty hair-raising things to say about it. But that stuff doesn't make it into the mass media. It's certainly people who are families or friends of these soldiers learn about this thing, and of course, a lot of soldiers are, they're wounded both in body and in mind, and sometimes they come home and they're very disturbed people after that kind of an experience. There's plenty of opportunity for people in the United States to know about what U.S. policy has been like and what its results have been. And those who are the heads of major foundations, the heads of universities, the good and the great of U.S. society, who truly have an influence about how things work, have every opportunity to learn about these things, and yet President Faust of Harvard University, is very happy to have someone like David Petraeus come there and give classes at the Kennedy School and so forth. And there was even the Petraeus doctrine of counterinsurgency was actually put down on paper and prepared for use in the U.S. Army at the Harvard Kennedy School. And no one said a thing. Well, if there had been at the Harvard Kennedy School a terror training, business, why, we certainly would have heard about it. But this kind of larger terror that is being done in the name of the state in the United States is taken for granted.
I mean, it's I feel like it's been talked about for quite a while, that the wars are about oil and other natural resources, minerals and things like that. Again, like, you would think enough people know in this country and other countries that are also part of keeping this war on terror going, that it is, right, it's not the war on terror. I mean, 14 years, that the U.S. has been involved in the Middle East, and it just keeps getting worse. I mean, something is clearly not right.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, when you said 14 years, perhaps that was a misstatement. I mean, the fact is the United States has been extremely actively involved
since 9/11
in the Middle East for an extremely long time. Yeah. It was mostly the Brits and the French who had control over the Middle East in the period after the First World War. They divided up the territory pretty much, and then after the Second World War, the Brits pulled back, and the French, and there was, of course, movements of national independence in places like Syria and Iraq, so the colonial powers were driven out, and the United States moved in various different ways. And in Syria, for example, the U.S. and the U.K. were in rivalry for influence over independent Syria. And so in the first few years after independence in 1945, there was it began with a civilian elected parliamentary government. But very quickly there was a series of military coups, and it was the CIA and MI6 of Britain that were behind those coups. And this is, of course, there was a famous coup in 1953 in Iran that overthrew the elected government of Mohammad Mossadegh.
Right.
This is so. Democratic governments have been overthrown by the United States and by the Western powers again and again and again. Yeah. And it still is going on, and sometimes violence is used, sometimes military coups, sometimes destabilization campaigns. I would say that on average, there's 2 or 3 of these things happen every year, just through the direct involvement of the United States, and just in a very, very visible fashion. And there's lots more that is less visible and harder to document and so on. But citizens of the United States, academics in particular, I find it outrageous that the academic experts in the Middle East for the most part, say nothing about these things. Why? Because their career moves more smoothly forward if they keep their tongue tied down and don't speak about it. And the same is true of people in the media. The same is true of intellectuals more generally.
Well,
and certainly in the policy domain, if you want to make a career in think tanks or in Washington anywhere, or work for as an advisor to a senator or something like that, you better not say these things. This is the open secret. That's what's so interesting about ideology and control, is that the most obvious things are not spoken about.
Well, that's why it's important for people to donate to Awake Radio, because I mean, I literally don't have to answer to anybody to, have people like yourself on, and other people who I've had on, John Kiriakou, Ray McGovern, who I'm sure he also writes for Consortium News. I was with Ray McGovern when he was arrested outside of the 92nd Street Y, when he tried to confront and ask David Petraeus, during the Q&A part of this talk that David Petraeus was giving at the 92nd Street Y over his, his training of these troops, and we were all ticket holders, and they wouldn't let Ray in, and protecting David Petraeus from answering, real questions.
Yes, well, this is the kind of attitude, this sort of politeness, this sense that these people are, quote, great Americans and so on, that they're patriots, that they're, doing this for everyone and so on. And this is what leads to a certain attitude towards people like Petraeus. And, of course, one of the notorious examples of this is Henry Kissinger, who I've been in a room where Henry Kissinger, at a conference where Henry Kissinger arrived, and all sorts of people broke into applause for this guy. He's one of the leading war criminals of the late 20th century.
Right.
And yet, people far from disapproving. I mean, the Harvard faculty in his department, the Department of Government, after he was serving in Washington for a long time, he wanted to go back into academia. And his friend Nelson Rockefeller said, fine, I will approach Harvard and tell them that I'll give them an endowed professorship for you if they will take you back. And the Rockefeller people approached Harvard, and Harvard and the faculty of the Department of Government said, no, we don't want him. He would be an embarrassment to us on this campus. And so they said no.
Oh, so good for them. I mean, at least they have they draw some lines.
Yes, I think that's right. That was a rare case of but it was private. They didn't make any public statements or anything like that, because that would have been completely out of line as far as they were concerned. But they wanted to be able to carry out their own rather shady dealings with the government, without their students accusing them of being complicit with Kissinger, whose reputation at that particular moment was, very, very besmirched and very low among people like students,
Right.
So that's really why they acted that way. I think you're right in pointing out the kind of slightly contradictory aspects of the thing. And I think they tried to get him to have a professorship at Columbia. And I think maybe it wasn't Harvard. Maybe it was Columbia, because he wanted to live in New York. He felt like New York was he already had his residence in New York. He went to Columbia, and the Columbia faculty said that. But in any event, whoever it was, he couldn't get a job at a prestigious university at that time. But yet in a very short order, all of that was conveniently forgotten by the good and the great, and he's applauded. He's regarded as a senior statesman. He meets with Obama. There's no bad marks on his record anymore.
It's like it's just like theater. They just keep this theatrics. To keep up, to keep the illusion of this war on terror going, when it's really about oil, minerals, natural resources.
And it's about rule. You see, rule within the state itself, that is to say, within the United States, within France, within Britain. You have societies that are gigantically unequal, where some have, billions of dollars and have huge amounts of power and influence, and the vast majority of the people live simply. They live better, certainly, than people do in Africa or in the Middle East, but nonetheless, they live very simply and with very, very little say over what goes on. And so it's the state and the way the state operates and the sort of shock and awe that is deployed by the state constantly, not only externally but internally as well, is part of the same story. And I used to, in Global Policy Forum's office, we looked out towards the UN. And when the President of the United States came there to speak every September, of course, there was a long motorcade and lots of, police on motorcycles. And so some people in my office would say, Jim, why does the President of the United States have travel with all those motorcycles? Doesn't that seem sort of strange? They don't provide him with any security, really. And I would always say, listen, this is part of the way in which the state, that is to say, the government, the apparatus of rule, demonstrates to its citizens the power, the might, and the awesome capacity of its sort of central institutions. And it's like in the colonial India, the British Viceroy would, every year in New Delhi, there would be a huge parade, and there was like 50 war elephants that were deployed as the Viceroy rode through the city streets. And so I would say to people in my office, those motorcycles are like the war elephants of the British Viceroy. They're supposed to tell us that this is a state that is rock solid and that is going to both protect us but also keep us in our place. And unfortunately, fortunately for us, we don't have bombs dropped on us. But certainly the people in the Middle East are reminded every day that Washington and London and Paris are prepared to do whatever it takes to ensure their power over the region.
And Obama's response to this attack in Paris, just talking about the atrocity of, killing innocent civilians, as if he's not part of doing the same thing himself.
Right. Well, of course, they, in their thinking, they think that whoever they kill is completely justified, and the people that they oppose kill people, and it's unjustified.
Right.
But whether it be Obama or François Hollande or David Cameron, they don't have any capacity for self-reflection, any capacity to put what they do in a context that would be persuasive to people, let's say somewhere in Africa or Asia or somewhere else where there wouldn't be this blindness that exists within the countries that these people rule over. So it's they're quite happy and content, and I've been in situations in New York where I've been with high-level policy people and very influential people who don't hesitate at all to say, I certainly hope we kill the bums, this kind of thing. I hope we kill those bastards as quickly as possible. And so their sense that their thirst, almost you might say, for killing people is they don't realize that it's that it's parallel to the killing thirst of the terrorists or whoever it is, some other enemy state or something like that, and they would love to kill Vladimir Putin and whoever else they wanted to kill. Of course, Fidel Castro, and made many efforts to assassinate him. And the idea of assassinating other heads of state is not something they hesitate to do. They don't do it too often, thank goodness, but overthrowing governments, which include the killing, let's say, of Salvador Allende in Chile, is something that they condone and even applaud.
So it was written and reported that one of the attackers in Paris said that it was in retaliation for France's involvement in Syria, that the reason why they were doing this.
Yes, that's right. Well, France does have quite a considerable responsibility. France was the colonial power in Syria from pretty much the end of World War I until 1945. And France did some horrendous things during the colonial period in Syria that are still well remembered. I mean, French tanks shelled, for example, the central bazaar in downtown Damascus during a period of protests against French rule. The tanks fired directly into buildings and destroyed a whole, large part of the city at that time. So the French weren't exactly representing the universality of human rights and so forth at the time. They were maintaining their rule in a very, very vicious way. But bringing us down closer to the present and looking at the civil war in Syria, that civil war began in 2011 as a peaceful protest that was part, really, of and inspired by the Arab Spring.
Right.
And it was very closely related to the events in Tunisia, for example, and in Egypt, and other countries, but those two in particular. And the government of Syria, the government of Bashar al-Assad, intervened against those peaceful protests in a very violent manner, more violent than the governments of Egypt and Tunisia. But nonetheless, the protesters wanted to keep a non-violent protest movement going. They did not want to, because I know some of these people and I talk with them on many occasions, and I know that they were very keen, in spite of the repression, to keep a non-violent movement. Now, the United States and France and Britain and their allies in the region, particularly Saudi Arabia and Turkey and Qatar, wanted, for geostrategic reasons in the Middle East, to overthrow the government of Bashar al-Assad. And so they began to provide arms, money, training, and so forth to create a violent opposition movement. And they thought that that was going to push over the government very rapidly, and that they would be able to control the government after that. And Israel was very actively, was then and is still very actively involved in this process as well. But they did not succeed in creating a movement that actually overthrew this, and it got more and more Islamized as the Saudis and the Qataris and as the United States started putting money into the Islamic movements. There were fighters that were coming in, streaming into Syria from Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, all over the Middle East. People who were battle-hardened fighters. And so the United States was, once again, as they had done in Afghanistan and so many other places, they were supporting directly and indirectly Islamic movements and fighters. And so it was that environment that led to the flourishing of Daesh, that is the Islamic State, and that led also to the expansion of the Jubha al-Nusra, which is the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria. And those are the two major rebel groups in the Syrian civil war, we shouldn't forget. So when John Kerry stands up and says, well, we are supporting the rebels, of course, the reasonable rebels and so on, he's always saying that the moderate, he likes to use the word moderate, but they're not supporting the moderate. The moderate rebels hardly even exist. And every time they give arms to a moderate group, it's the other ones that take them away, and they immediately go into supporting the Islamic fundamentalists. So it's a very strange situation that most people find impossible to understand. That is to say that the United States is supporting Daesh and opposing them at the same time.
Right. Well, there they do play both sides. I mean, that's what they do.
Yes, but this is not two sides. This is one side.
Right.
It's not like supporting, Iran as well as Iraq in the Iran-Iraq war. We know that happened.
Right.
Iraq was the main recipient of U.S. Arms and support, but also they did give Iran. Iraq was the main recipient, but Iran did get some military support as well.
And it also, of course, profits the weapon industries, and I think they just they made a blimp.
Of course.
They made a blimp. I'm trying to remember the name of the company that just recently they were testing out a blimp.
Yes, I'm afraid I don't know that particular case, but there has been a tremendous sale. Actually, Saudi Arabia is the main recipient. It practically supports the U.S. arms industry beyond the United States military itself. There's a lot of arms that are bought by the Saudis, and some of those arms get passed on to other players and some of their friends, and they certainly provided a lot of arms to the to elements that included former army officers of Saddam Hussein and Islamic fundamentalists and so forth in what is called the Sunni Triangle in western and northern Iraq. And this is part of what, this is the area that was eventually taken over by Daesh. So they're really reaping what they sowed.
Right. Yeah.
But it's really it's such a paradoxical situation. But I think if you look at other histories, I've just been reading a lot of books about ancient Rome, and of course Rome was a very, very violent. The people talk about the Pax Romana and the peace of the Roman Empire, but it actually wasn't peaceful at all. It was extremely violent all the time. There was fighting going on not only on the outer periphery of the empire, but also internally in various civil wars and so on. So this is this is what our leaders have created for us,
Yeah.
and that's what we have to realize. And you're absolutely right in saying it's going to be exceedingly difficult, perhaps next to impossible to stop. But I think it's our responsibility, those of us who both understand the situation and are ready to speak about it honestly, unlike most of the intellectuals who choose to remain silent. And we have to speak out, and we have to try to persuade fellow citizens to be opposed to this. I think most people in the United States actually not only understand in some measure what's going on, but also oppose these policies, but they're not able to, actually succeed in stopping them. That's what happened with the Iraq War. The Iraq War, there was a massive majority that was opposed to that war, and yet it happened anyway.
Wouldn't, I know it's a little drastic, but just not paying taxes, I feel like it kind of would be one of the most easiest ways to at least, pull the plug somewhat. If the people could just get organized enough and, just withdraw. I mean, it's the people's tax money that's going to this.
Yes, that's true. Well, of course, there are many ideas about how to influence and how to change policy in the United States and in these European countries, in France. But there isn't an easy solution. Otherwise, it would have been grabbed long ago, and it would have been implemented by honest citizens who want to see things be different. But it isn't easy, and these democratic states, which are democratic in a limited sense, and which have tremendous resources at their disposal, tremendous propaganda apparatuses, and so on, and they're able to withstand criticism and withstand all kinds of efforts to change them fundamentally. And this is something that future historians will, if we have a future in terms of the terrible climate change that's threatening the very basis of life on the planet. Exactly. And so we don't know quite what's going to be happening 100 years from now. But as people maybe look back on this particular phase in history, and they wonder, my goodness, how do these leaders and how do these leading groups, how do these wealthy people, how could it be that, for example, the CEO of General Electric could make more money in 1 year, this was a few years back, than I think it was 29,000 GE employees in Mexico.
I just think of it as a sign of mental illness. I mean, I really do at this point. I mean, for somebody to need that much money, I mean, it's just not healthy. Like
No.
there's something inside of them trying to compensate. They're trying to compensate for some inferiority. I mean, I don't know what else it could be, but so I guess
Well, it's considered to be a success in a capitalist society. The person who makes the most money is honored as being somebody who is smart, who especially somebody who earns the money themselves and doesn't inherit it. Why they're considered to be absolutely wonderful by most people.
but they're not
And,
really earning it
and
though.
so they don't. Nobody is really saying to them, "This is a sick situation."
Yeah.
People are saying, "Oh, thank you for, giving a professorship or building a new wing on the hospital or whatever it is they do with a small portion of their money." And those workers are probably many of them saying, "Thank you for employing us. We're very glad that." We're very glad we have a job, whereas other people we know don't, and so on. So that when you get inside of a system, things appear to be very logical, and so the people who are carrying out, whether it be those in the apparatus of the state who carry out these very, very violent policies, or people in the apparatuses of the economy, who again, have their own, vicious policies that they're trying to drive people's wages down or whatever.
So, James Paul, I want to thank you for this interview on Organic News on Awake Radio. Your article, Grasping the Motives for Terror for Consortium News, people can read that, and you're the author of Syria Unmasked, and longtime editor for the Oxford Companion to Politics of the World and executive director of the Middle East Research and Information Project. I want to thank you, and it needs to get exposed. I mean, it's the people that have to, say no to this, or else it's just going to continue.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure to be with you, and thanks for your good work, and, good luck with it.
Thank you very much.